When disaster strikes, all order is destroyed, money becomes worthless, order is empty talk, and the only guarantee is strength. And I, possessing power, do as I please. The end of the world has arrived. Ming not only needs to become stronger, but also needs to deal with neighbors who constantly ask their wives to borrow food. Madam, you can't always borrow food empty-handed, can you? Keywords of the novel. Apocalypse. My Proficiency Panel No Pop-ups, Apocalypse. My Proficiency Panel Complete Collection Download, Apocalypse. My Proficiency Panel Latest Chapter Reading. Chapter 1. Apocalypse. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1 Apocalypse. If one day, disaster strikes, facing the crisis of survival and the threat of death. Is having one's own strength important, or is the power to mobilize strength important? Turn left and choose your own strength. Turn right and choose power and influence. Half asleep and half awake, it seemed that there were two light gates on the left and right in front of me, and I walked towards the left by a strange twist. In August, the high-hanging sun baked the bustling city like an oven, and the pitch-black asphalt floor was filled with hot and steaming heat. In a small rental room in an old residential area, a young man rushed into the bathroom, cursing and slapping his head. Damn it, I definitely won't stay up late tonight. Vague curses rang out in the small room, accompanied by the sound of washing water. The simple layout of the room can be clearly seen through the sunlight. On the east side of the room, there is a large bed, a refrigerator, and a wardrobe. On the west side, there is a table and chair near the door, and there is a bathroom even deeper. Next to the table and chairs stood a red tassel spear and an iron sword, but the faint dust on top clearly indicated that they were in a state of constant dust consumption. Obviously, these are all the results of 3 minutes of heat. After a moment, Ming walked out of the bathroom and looked at his small room in the house he shared with others. He took a long breath, then shook his head and prepared to go out. He, who just graduated this year, has clean pockets like most people. He rents a house, looks for a job, and is full of pitfalls. After struggling for half a year, he finally adapted to this place. His previous marketing job was also dismissed by him. Although the money in my pocket has bottomed out, the new company that I just interviewed successfully yesterday is a good one. The basic salary is 6,000 yuan, the performance is 15,000 yuan, and the total attendance is 800 yuan. Including housing allowance, meal allowance, and car allowance, I can earn 9,000 yuan per month. In addition, there are many beautiful young women in the company, which makes Ming look forward to the changes this new job will bring to his life, and even gives rise to a sense of anticipation for the future. Walking to the anti-theft door of the shared room, I happened to meet a woman wearing hot pants. When I saw Ming, I immediately smiled and said, "Hey, you're also going to work. It's such a coincidence." "Yes, report at 2 p.m. Ming glanced at the other person, whose smooth and delicate long legs made him hesitant to look too much. He just hurriedly walked through the living room. This is the wife of the couple who shared the apartment with him. They have been married for 2 years and have been struggling in this city. However, due to their personality differences, communication between the two is very rare. So far, they only know each other's name is Zhang Yuan, 1 year older than him. "I'll leave first." Line. After a brief conversation, Ming quickly walked down the unit building. Behind her, Zhang Yuan watched curiously as Ming walked down the building. She was curious about her somewhat unfamiliar neighbor, but their relationship was not very good, so she stopped this thought. Although he is a neighbor, due to social taboos, Ming never interacts much in order to avoid male and female conflicts. He is afraid that one day he may not be able to hold back his anger and gradually causes some embarrassing things. In addition, her husband and Ming have a disagreement, so they know very little about each other. As for the conflict between Ming and her husband, it's actually nothing to say. It's just that there were a few times when Ming saw his gaze colliding while walking, and he didn't pay attention to it, even with a look of contempt in his eyes. Li Ming naturally wouldn't have a hot face or a cold buttocks, and the other person gradually made him feel that he was a very self-centered man. Over time, the two of them seemed a bit strangers, and the connection between the two families relied entirely on Zhang Yuan and his limited conversation. However, such a conversation is only limited to this. The first time Li Ming went to the new company, he naturally entered with a high spirit, but as a result, he only followed a few other newcomers for a simple training session throughout the afternoon, and the afternoon ended. When I got off the subway and rode on an electric bike, two things remembered in my mind. The female manager who trained them had white legs, and there were many beautiful women in the office. Li Ming suddenly felt like he was in the right place. On the way back, I happily purchased a large batch of supplies and happily moved them home. When I arrived at my doorstep, I happened to meet my neighbor's wife, a young woman who had finished work. "Yo, after buying so many things, I made a big purchase today." Zhang Yuan immediately raised her eyebrows and smiled jokingly. Just after work, Zhang Yuan was delicate and casual, with delicate white skin beneath her neck that seemed to exude a fragrance. Her slender legs stood together, and her delicate and charming face, dressed in light makeup, had just opened the door and sat in the living room to change her shoes. "I just finished eating at home, so I'll add a wave." Li Ming responded with a faint smile, saying that the two of them have similar commuting times, so they often meet during commuting hours, which is normal. While speaking, Zhang Yuan's husband Peng Ji glanced at him from the room when he heard the commotion, and then ignored it. Peng Ji's glance was caught by Li Ming, and he didn't say anything to Zhang Yuan duo anymore. He brought everything back to his room in the other person's smile, and after arranging it neatly, he couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Then he wiped his sweat and was too lazy to go to the kitchen shared by him and Peng Ji's family to cook. Even if his own pot was there, he simply cut open the watermelon he bought and ate it all for dinner. The coolness of watermelon really relieved the dryness on my body. After finishing, I threw away the watermelon skin, wiped the table, and lay comfortably on the bed. After turning on the fan, I couldn't help but breathe. When the rent expires, make sure to switch to a room with air conditioning. Thinking about the choice he made to save money, Li Ming, who had been experiencing air conditioning at the company all afternoon, thought to himself. However, accustomed to the hot and dry summer, he felt that he could tolerate the fan at night, so he no longer cared. According to the lease agreement, if he doesn't rent for 6 months, his deposit of 1,200 yuan will not be able to be recovered from the agent. He has only been living here for 3 months now, and he has to endure discomfort. Thinking in his heart, Li Ming couldn't help but glance around the room and finally landed on the brand new iron sword standing next to the long table behind the door, as well as a red tassel gun with a powerful spearhead. The idea suddenly arose in my heart to take out the weapon that I had bought on Taobao, which I had been thinking of for a while, and play with it. Although I had a strong desire to practice diligently after buying it, I never played with it much and have been eating dust ever since Li Ming's body wriggled, thinking about the heat of just going upstairs and the comfort of lying in bed and blowing a fan now. The key is to change shoes when going out. Forget it, wash and sleep. I didn't cook at the right time. I have enough time. Brush TikTok is comfortable and can go to bed early. Li Ming immediately convinced himself, and then went to the bathroom to take a shower. He was comfortable in his underpants and lay on the bed. Satisfied, he brushed TikTok. Brushing and brushing, it was already 11:47 p.m. unconsciously. Li Ming had completely forgotten the decision he made to go to bed at 10 a.m. in the morning, and looked at his phone. He felt that it was already this time, so he decided to brush until 12 p.m. before going to bed. So, Li Ming really brushed until midnight. At 12 o'clock, the moon was bright, and just as Li Ming wanted to continue painting, something suddenly popped out in front of him. The end of disaster is about to occur, rule change begins, adapters are born, and unsuitable ones are transformed into demonic corpses. Proficiency panel open. What is it? Li Ming was taken aback for a moment. Before he could take a closer look, he felt his brain in a daze and fell asleep on the bed in a daze. It seemed like a hazy black mist swept by, and in an instant, the entire planet fell into silence. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Doomsday, Proficiency Panel. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Doomsday, Proficiency Panel. It was as if his bone marrow had been emptied, and a strong sense of discomfort made Li Ming wake up in a struggle. He suddenly opened his eyes, and the room was already bright. Surprisingly, I fell asleep in a daze. What was that thing last night? Li Ming couldn't help but be shocked in his heart. He slept so soundly that he didn't even dream for a second. The excellent sleep experience he had not experienced in a long time made his mental state very good, and even his mood improved. But I couldn't help but feel doubts about what suddenly popped up before going to bed last night. What disaster is the end of time? What proficiency panel? The confusion in his heart made him unable to resist getting out of bed and wanting to walk to the window to check the situation. As he flipped over, he couldn't help but open his phone and glanced at the time. It was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he suddenly felt stunned. He had slept for so long. Just as I was about to put down my phone, I suddenly glanced at the upper right corner. Why is the phone out of signal? Li Ming's fingers involuntarily tightened. Combining with the strange and overly peaceful morning of last night, a sense of unease arose in his heart. Then, holding his phone, he walked to the window in the middle of the room with his slippers and looked down. The sunshine outside is bright, but the community is empty and there is no one around. Just as Li Ming was confused and wanted to go back and put on his clothes, he suddenly saw a figure rushing into his field of vision. He couldn't help but shift his gaze and his pupils shrank. What kind of monster is this? The shared apartment is on the 5th floor, not very high, so Li Ming can have a good look at the people downstairs. At this moment, in his line of sight, a rotting monster with some long tissues falling out of its left eye and drooping in front of it was frantically rushing towards a black cat in the community. Meow! The black cat quickly dodged and the monster pounced on the green tree. Scream! The green tree trembled as if a strong man had fiercely attacked it. But the black cat had already jumped far and ran away. The monster let out a strange cry as if it was stuck in its throat, and then disappeared from sight with more eyeballs that had been knocked out. Standing by the bed, Li Ming's mouth slightly opened, revealing a hint of surprise in his heart. If he had the idea of dressing up like this before the person hit the tree, then with this collision and the strange roar, combined with last night's voice, the idea in his heart had already dissipated. Even a fool wouldn't hit his head so hard into a tree, and after the collision, he continued to pounce on the next one as if nothing had happened. Even if a fool does this, they will definitely fall to the ground suddenly after a collision, rather than leaving in a lively manner. So, unexpectedly, a zombie came out. Li Ming felt a strong sense of shock in his heart, and he instinctively thought of the strange words that suddenly appeared last night. Catastrophic apocalypse. Survival of the fittest, transformation of the maladaptive into demonic corpses. The heart tightened, and a strong sense of horror rose in Li Ming's heart. He quickly closed the window, drew the curtains, and turned around to take the gun and sword that had been placed in the corner to eat dust. With the weapon in his hand, he felt a sense of security in his heart. Then, unable to resist a thought, he quickly put on his clothes and shoes, and sat on the bed to blow a fan. Suddenly, I remembered my neighbor next door and my eyes narrowed. What if they also turned into demon corpses? Li Ming quickly ran to the back of the door and locked it tightly, then blocked the door with the only table. He breathed a sigh of relief and sat back by the bed. He picked up his phone and glanced at it, but there was no signal, and he suddenly felt a bit dazed. Did the end of the day come so suddenly? He just found a job with many beautiful women and decent money. Now it's okay, the end of the day has arrived, isn't everything useless? With thoughts in his heart, Li Ming suddenly felt a sense of crisis. He couldn't help but anxiously stand up from the spot and start thinking about how to survive. From the current perspective, the biggest change should be the wandering zombies outside. As long as I don't go out, this danger can be avoided. But what should I do after finishing my family's food? Ming thought about it for a moment. Yesterday, he supplemented a bag of rice weighing 40 pounds, a bag of flour weighing 10 pounds, pork weighing 10 pounds, vegetables and fruits, seasoning, and the remaining pickled vegetables. If combined, he could survive for 2 months to the limit. But what about 2 months later? Waiting in the air for rescue. No, we can't rely on these unknown possibilities. We need to find a way to save ourselves. Ming couldn't help but think to himself that even if he persisted for 2 months, he would probably gasp for breath if he walked 2 steps weekly due to lack of nutritional supplements, and the zombies outside might not necessarily have any changes. They are all referred to as demonic corpses, and it is possible for them to become stronger and stronger in the future. Under the balance of ups and downs, he has no way to survive. With a rapid mental transformation, Ming immediately thought of going out to search for supplies. He tightened his weapon and couldn't help but think of the scene where the zombie collided with a big tree and was injured. From there, it can be seen that although zombies are terrifying, they are not too scary either. Although they are not as easy to monetize as in movies and TV dramas, at least they are not completely impossible to face. A person's strength can greatly increase in a short period of time through exercise within a certain range. If they exercise their body in the next few days, then use their weapons and knives, and make use of environmental factors, they may not be unable to kill. Unless this zombie is a special case of weakness. I will observe again in the next few days. If possible, there is a small supermarket next to the community. Even if it is dangerous to finish the food, you must first go to the small supermarket to get some supplies. In his heart, Ming couldn't help but feel very grateful for having weapons and purchasing some supplies in advance. In the past, weapons were just toys, and food was nothing but bought and made for the sake of saving money, but now these have become a means of survival. A person's heart never lacks courage, it's just that they haven't been pushed to the limit. Otherwise, even a young man would dare to splatter 3 feet of blood. Moreover, Ming, a young man in his early 20s, was filled with passionate passion in his heart. When I regretted it before, I thought it was a waste of money, but now it seems that this thing is much more important than money. Ming couldn't help but smile, then his heart moved and he stood up to look at 2 weapons. The red tassel on the left is 2.2 meters long. In fact, this length is only an entry-level model, but it is also sufficient for beginners, so Ming did not buy a longer one. However, if practicing, this weapon room cannot be used. The long sword blade on the right was 75 centimeters long and 105 centimeters overall, which was quite convenient. Ming quickly went to eat something to fill his stomach, and then took the long sword to the empty space in the room, unable to help but want to give it a try. Miso. The long sword was unsheathed, and its almost unused body remained shiny as new. Ming put down the scabbard and stood in place, holding the sword. Shwa shwa shwa. The long sword was waved casually a few times to relieve his emotions, and Ming recalled the basic swordsmanship skill he had learned at the Bilibili station on a whim. The lunge and stabbing sword. To practice swordsmanship, one must also find a way, and starting with these basic skills that have been learned before is the only effective way he can think of. Thinking back in his heart, he took a breath and his body turned slightly stiff. However, he tried to use his sword step by step according to the steps he had memorized in his heart, and then fiercely thrust his sword forward. The long sword thrust forward, and the weight made Ming very uncomfortable, and his posture was also slightly twisted. Even because the trajectory of the long sword's thrust was not straight, the end of the hilt hit the arm, and the force used was strange. The thrust had no power, and it even injured oneself. Gone. Ming has a toothache. Not to mention killing zombies with this crotch-pulling sword technique, he even suspects that he will swell his arms after practicing for a long time. He couldn't help but hold back a force, pondering how to correctly thrust the long sword while repeatedly thrusting the long sword in his hand. Repeated more than 10 times in a row, Li Ming felt a bit tired in his arms. His finished sword weighed 3 pounds, which didn't sound much, but it was quite difficult for him, who had not been trained for a long time, to play it freely. So much so that after more than 10 attempts, the sword technique was not correctly stabbed out once, and the hilt even hit his little arm red. Li Ming was not convinced and gritted his teeth, enduring the stiffness of his arms as he continued to practice. Fortunately, despite using his brain and thinking 10 times, he did not achieve nothing. At least his posture became proficient, so he stabbed more than 10 times in a row. Finally, one time made him feel smoother. Whoosh! The long sword thrust forward, with its body steadily following a straight trajectory, and even with full force, the hilt did not hit his arm. Li Ming withdrew with satisfaction, thinking that his arm no longer needed to be injured. He was about to show a pleased smile, but the next moment he suddenly froze and joyfully grasped the hilt of his sword. Experience points of lunge and sword stab +1, a line of handwriting drifted by, and in an instant, a stack of information unfolded in front of Li Ming. Name: Li Ming, life. 23/95, skill. Bowing and stabbing sword, beginners training 1%, this is the prompt that rose last night, the proficiency panel. Li Ming clenched his sword hilt tightly, waves of joy rising in his heart. He felt as if he could instantly clear the clouds and see the blue sky. The unease in my heart fell from the air, like the tide receding and settling down a lot. After digesting the information, he carefully studied the panel and found that except for the skill bar, there was no response to the other data. The lifespan should be based on the current age and the number of years I can live to. It is natural for my physical health to live to 95 years old, which is already higher than the average lifespan. Can the name be directly displayed as the real name? It can't be changed. After studying each piece of information, Li Ming couldn't help but click on the only introduction that could move the bow and stab sword. The next moment, the information came into view. Bow step stab sword, incomplete level skill. The brief introduction of the information left Li Ming stunned, and he was immediately pulled back to his thoughts by the sudden scream outside the door. Ah, monster! Is this voice Zhang Yuan's? What happened? Li Ming couldn't help but frown and withdrew his sword to look outside. After thinking for a moment, I didn't rush to open the door to look, but walked lightly behind the door to listen. Don't shout, if you hear it, you'll come running towards us. Fortunately, the accompanying sound of Peng Zhi made Li Ming shake his head and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. He was just wondering if it was Peng Zhi who turned into a zombie and attacked Zhang Yuan again, but fortunately not. Otherwise, if the zombies appear directly in the shared room, it will be troublesome. Feeling that there was no danger, Li Ming went out to take a look. Now that there has been such a big change, we need to discuss countermeasures with our neighbors. He is not a solitary person, and in this situation, it is obviously better for everyone to discuss together than waiting alone, because more people always discover more information than less. If you miss any information due to being alone, you may miss an opportunity to change the situation. Thinking in his heart, Li Ming also opened the door and walked to the living room, glancing into Zhang Yuan's room. Wearing slippers and hot pants, Zhang Yuan, who had exposed her entire white and slender legs, was standing on the hallway facing the door with a panicked and bewildered face. Li Ming even saw some private parts protruding from the bottom of her hot pants in this direction. Beside her, Peng Zhizhen, wearing shorts and a white sweater, stared out the window with an embarrassed expression. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. The Impotent Generation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. The Impotent Generation. Have you seen it? There are zombies outside. The sound ringing in the living room pulled Peng Zhi and Zhang Yuan, who were now filled with stiffness, back to their senses, and Peng Zhi seemed to be startled. The two quickly turned around and saw Li Ming, dressed neatly and carrying a long sword, standing in the living room. Right, you saw it too. That's a zombie downstairs. Zhang Yuan's mind suddenly thought of the zombie downstairs, and her face turned pale in an instant. However, when she saw someone else's fear, she found a way to vent it and quickly turned around to respond. What's going on? Even the zombie thing has come out. I need to go out and take a look. When encountering the danger of monsters and encountering other humans, Peng Zhi, whose face was very ugly, instinctively said that he could naturally gain some sense of security. However, before leaving his own home, he suddenly froze in place. No, there are monsters like zombies outside now. It's too dangerous to just go out like this. Call the police, let's call the police first. Peng Zhi muttered to himself in a rapid voice, gasping for breath as he finished speaking. He was about to take out his phone from his pocket, but when he felt empty, he suddenly gasped and said, "Where's my phone, special, where's my phone?" After shouting twice in a row, I hurriedly wandered around looking for it. My neck turned red with anger, and then I suddenly found my phone on the long table behind me. I rushed over and opened it, only to see it. No signal. How could there be no signal? Peng Zhi was dumbfounded, completely stunned in place. Zhang Yuan on one side also took out her phone and looked at her, her eyes becoming equally stunned. Li Ming frowned as he watched the two of them moaning and groaning. His gaze withdrew from Zhang Yuan's leg and he turned back to the room. This Peng Zhi usually holds himself high, how could he be so useless when faced with something? Returning to the room, Li Ming twitched at the corner of his mouth, feeling a bit speechless in his heart. The level of a person's ability is actually most reflected in the face of a crisis. Peng Zhiping has been dragging around 70,000 to 80,000 yuan a day, but now when he encounters something, he has not reacted for so long, which is a bit funny. He was still thinking of discussing with them how to get along and live in this post-apocalyptic world. Although he has a mysterious panel that can enhance his strength, if he has a reliable teammate in the short term, even if he has to go out to search for food in the future when he becomes the main player, it will be safer. And he is determined to train weapons every day. If someone helps him cook or something, he can also have more time to train. So, no matter from what perspective, if these two people can be used well, they can bring him help. However, I didn't expect that at this critical moment, Peng Zhi would be so close. Now their emotions are shaking, and even if they want to discuss, they probably can't come up with anything. Let's wait for them to calm down before we talk. I hope their food is also sufficient. Although Li Ming's food has been replenished, those vegetables won't last long, let alone two adults. It's so dangerous outside now, and besides, the apocalyptic crisis is already clear. He doesn't want to borrow this precious thing like food, nor does he want to hear two people make such a fuss about him. But if he really had to reach that point, facing the only living person around him, Li Ming didn't know if he would choose to lend out his food. Especially, he had long had the idea of going out to solve the danger of searching for food, and his own strength was bound to become strong enough under the influence of cheating. However, even so, he doesn't want to see others eating his own food every day, it would be so annoying. Encountering a garbage teammate is really disgusting. If you could help me with something, it would be more likely. Ming's mind changed slightly, and then he didn't wait any longer. Instead, he took the opportunity to pick up his long sword and continue practicing in the room. He stood with his legs half bent apart, his right long sword flat fingered then twisted around his waist and thrust forward with all his strength. Whoosh! The long sword pierced through the air with a straight thrust, and its trajectory presented a perfect straight line, striking fiercely ahead. Experience points of lunge and sword stab +1, looking at the numbers floating in front of him, a smile appeared on the corner of Li Ming's mouth. After the stab sword gained a tactile sensation, it became much easier to practice. In addition, with the advent of the apocalypse, zombies were clearly swaying in the downstairs community. He felt a sense of urgency in his heart, so the idea of training became even more urgent. Next, Ming carefully experienced the feeling of using his legs, waist, and arms to exert force together with each sword thrust, and carefully controlled the trajectory of the long sword thrust. Every time, Ming tried his best to use his maximum strength to stab the long sword, and every time, he tried his best to control the smooth thrust of the long sword. Stabbing swords is no different from others, and each time interval is short, so before long, Ming stabbed more than 40 swords in a row. Among them, 32 swords reached the standard level, and the remaining 8 swords did not accumulate experience points due to poor performance. Every increase in experience points has deepened Ming's mastery of bowing and stabbing sword. Nowadays, with an increase in proficiency at the level of beginner and beginner, his mastery of bowing and stabbing sword has also improved. At the very least, when it comes to seriously stabbing the sword, the long sword can almost always be stabbed smoothly, without the embarrassing situation of uneven sword body or even hitting one's own arm at the tail. With more than 40 consecutive thrusts, his right arm holding the long sword also became sour and powerless, which was a sequela of sudden and excessive bursts of strength without exercise for a long time. After 40 swords, he surprisingly lost the strength to stab the sword again. You're really weak. Fortunately, you didn't go out recklessly to kill zombies. Feeling his powerless right arm, Ming stopped helplessly and then placed his long sword back in its sheath against the wall. With his left hand, he picked up a cup of water and drank it. While drinking water, Ming suddenly remembered something and quickly went to the bathroom to turn on the faucet and collect water from the bucket. There is only half a barrel of bottled water left, although the tap water here can also be consumed, it's hard to say if the water stops. Ming felt a little nervous in his heart. Just having food without water is not enough. Besides, he also has to train. The most necessary thing for sweating profusely every day is water. Without water, it's absolutely not possible. As for salt, he still has more than half a box at home. When I was browsing the internet before, I happened to see a whole box of big special prices that were not expensive, so I bought it. Now it seems fortunate. In addition, there are 2 large pots of oil and other supplies that are sufficient for a short period of time. Only water, very tense. Watching the bucket take some time to fill, he walked to the kitchen with a basin and turned on the edible tap water in the kitchen, then added water to the basin. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Discussion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4 Discussion. The faucet was running with a clattering sound. When one of the pots in the kitchen was filled and he switched to the second one, Ming quickly carried the first pot of water home and waited in the bathroom for a while. When the water in the bucket was full, he turned off the faucet and changed the position of the bucket filled with water. The right arm, which was sore from practicing swordsmanship, felt very uncomfortable when doing these things, like a needle prick. Ming gritted his teeth and endured it, then went to the kitchen to fill the second basin with water and replaced it with the last empty basin. So back and forth, filling all 3 water basins and buckets and storing them directly under the water heater, my worries still haven't eased. Especially the occasional screams and intense screams of pain outside the window, which were not like human voices, were accompanied by the words cannibalistic, and Ming's forehead was sweating upon hearing them. You can't let the soreness in your right arm go unchecked, you need to relieve it with a massage. Ming thought to himself, following the dim sky, touching his stomach, and then cooking dinner. He wanted to rest after finishing his meal, but he looked at the red tassel gun standing next to him and couldn't help but walk from the bedroom to the living room with a long gun in his left hand. Compared to the bedroom, this place is much more spacious, and a 2.2-meter long gun can barely be used. He needs to familiarize himself with both of these weapons as soon as possible. Ming turned around and glanced at Pingji's house. His bedroom door was open for ventilation, and in the living room, he could see the guy pressing his phone urgently, sitting on the bed twisting and turning. Zhang Yuan was also watching him, feeling lost. He shook his head, his left hand in front, and his right hand in the back. He lunged and took a long gun, fiercely thrusting forward. Whoosh! The long spear thrust forward fiercely, perhaps due to some experience gained from practicing stabbing swords. This one was decent, but the numbness and weakness of the arms involved, as well as the faint soreness in the right leg and waist used to exert force during practice, still made Li Ming's mouth twitch. The basic attack of marksmanship is to stop and attack, and Li Ming's stab is the one in the basic marksmanship. Of course, it's just a nickname learned from the video, and he's not very clear about the specifics. And because his interest in swordsmanship was dampened, when it came to marksmanship, he only downloaded a few instructional videos and threw them in the corner like swordsmanship, eating dust. No, it's different from swordsmanship. After all, guns are not easier to carry than swords. Carrying a gun when going out is really eye-catching. Li Ming is sorry, so he hasn't practiced it a few times. So this time, it was only natural that he did not receive any response from the panel. He then withdrew his gun and drew a circle to the left while leaning back to use a block. He then straightened his body and drew a circle to the right to use a grip, and then leaned forward to use a stab. Although in Li Ming's view, shooting is the most important means of attack, since stopping and holding a spear is classified as the foundation, it proves that it is very important. Li Ming does not want to neglect one aspect and lose the other, so even if it is the first practice, they all practice together. He continued to stop, take, and stab the gun for the third time. Zha. Whoosh. Finally, the movements are coherent and smooth. Spear Proficiency +1, Skill. Spear, Beginners and Beginners 1%, a transparent message floated past Li Ming, located at the top of his field of vision. He immediately felt an additional sensation in his heart, and he once again urged himself to withdraw his gun. Stop, take, tie. Whoosh. There was no movement. Just one level of proficiency is still too low to make significant changes. Li Ming let out a light breath, but this shot did not unleash the same force as the waist, arms, and legs that had been stabbed. It can be considered a puncture failure. It's normal to not increase proficiency. However, this is another set of actions, and Li Ming feels like he's really trembling a bit. He didn't dare to hold on and continue practicing. He had a premonition in his heart that he would wake up tomorrow with muscle soreness all over his body. Li Ming stood up from his horse stance, feeling a kind of soreness. He tugged at the corner of his mouth and walked back to the room with a slightly weak body. He put away his red tassel gun, then thought for a moment, picked up a towel, and walked into the bathroom. A practice session not only resulted in muscle weakness but also sweat all over the body. I need to take a quick wash while there is still water. Taking a shower when feeling powerless was also a painful thing. Li Ming persevered through the entire process, changed into clothes, wiped his hair, and suddenly heard a knock on the door. Li Ming, is it convenient? Upon hearing the inquiry, it should be Zhang Yuan's. Li Ming wiped his hair and bravely went to open the door, enduring the pain. The bedroom door opened, and Zhang Yuan was still dressed in the same outfit she had just seen. Her clothes were soft and clear, her lips half pursed, her face worried, and she was standing in front of the door with her legs standing side by side. I just saw you practicing shooting in the living room. Do you know what's going on outside now? No matter how hard the phone is, we can't get through, we can't access the internet, and there are monsters biting people. Zhang Yuan saw Li Ming open the door and quickly spoke up. She had just witnessed what was happening in the same building across from her in her own room, and her face remained pale when she spoke. She knew it wasn't as simple as biting someone. No matter what the reason is for the phone being disconnected, the internet disappearing, or these biting monsters, all can only prove that it is very dangerous outside. Seeing Zhang Yuan's pale face, Li Ming knew that she wanted an idea in her heart. He quickly spoke, his voice calm and steady, which invisibly relieved Zhang Yuan's tense expression. What we can do now is to stay at home, work hard to develop the ability to protect ourselves, and then wait for the opportunity to be rescued. Li Ming looked at Zhang Yuan and said seriously, his face slightly relieved when he saw her, but he also spoke with confusion. How much food do you have at home, how long can you eat, calculate well, and tell your husband to exercise well these 2 days so that he can have the opportunity to go out and replenish supplies in the future. Although those monsters may seem terrifying, their strength is actually similar to that of ordinary people. As long as we men exercise well and use weapons reasonably, it should not be difficult to deal with. Li Ming sincerely said to Zhang Yuan, and after hearing Li Ming's words, Zhang Yuan also woke up from a dream. She immediately thought about the food at home, and her face became a bit anxious. Our family only has some surplus left. I was planning to replenish it next time I have a break. What should I do? How much more time is there? Li Ming raised his eyebrows and asked in a deep voice. It's still enough for 5 days. Zhang Yuan pursed her lips and hurriedly said. 5 days. If I exercise well, I don't know where I can go. However, if possible, it would be safer for 2 people to work together when exploring outside. Don't worry, go back and tell your husband to exercise well these days. Take up the clothes drying pole and practice. Eat well these days. After practicing, we will go out together to search for food. There will be a lot of food in the community supermarket. Li Ming pondered in his heart and suggested, but Zhang Yuan nodded repeatedly and said, I'll go find Peng Zhi and tell him that you happen to have weapons. After Zhang Yuan finished speaking, she quickly turned around and walked back in her slippers, handing what Li Ming had said to Peng Zhi, who was still anxiously tinkering with her phone. Peng Zhi frowned upon hearing this. What kind of brain is he? He's thinking about going out when it's so dangerous outside. If he doesn't go, he'll go by himself. I'll just stay at home and wait for rescue. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Thoughts on helping borrow grain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Thoughts on helping borrow grain. 5 days of food. Even if you eat 1 or 2 meals a day, you won't starve to death. If you save money, you can eat for 10 days. Is the probability of surviving after 10 days of rescue, or is it higher to consume 4 days of food and survive after exercise? Peng Zhi ignored Li Ming's suggestion when his wife related, and after glancing at his phone, which still had no signal, he anxiously took it and walked to the window, secretly extending it outside. As a result, there was still no signal, so I was a bit disappointed and took my phone back. He wants to exercise himself, don't worry about him. Besides, he has something, we don't have anything, can we listen to him? Turning around from the window, Peng Zhi spoke indifferently, then looked up at Li Ming's room and suddenly his expression changed. He bought so much grain the day before yesterday, so he can eat it alone for 2 months before he can finish it. Wife, you go ask and see if you can borrow some. Peng Zhi's eyes flickered and he smiled at the corner of his mouth, saying, he's in such a hurry to go out and work hard. It's also a waste of food to keep. It's better to lend us some and let's eat for 2 more days. Maybe eating for another 2 days will help us overcome this crisis. When someone comes to save us, we don't have to eat as much as we want, just give him some more. Peng Zhiyue thought it was more appropriate, and then couldn't help but look at his wife. He just finished tinkering, so there shouldn't be much to do now. Go see if there's anything you can help with, and then ask him to borrow some food. This kid is unmarried and has a thin skin, so he must feel embarrassed to refuse. Ah, that's not good, is it? Upon hearing what her husband said, Zhang Yuan hesitated and couldn't help but say. What's wrong? What's wrong with borrowing something from the neighbors? When they're rescued, I'll give it back to them. Peng Zhi impatiently waved his hand and asked her to hurry while Li Ming was still not resting. Taking advantage of the fact that we haven't felt the importance of food yet, can we still borrow it? When we feel the importance of food, can we borrow it again? Peng Zhili was furious and urged his wife to leave, so he quickly took action. Zhang Yuan pursed her lips before finally getting up and leaving. I practiced too hard. In the kitchen, Li Ming was preparing something to eat when he took out the milk powder that he had previously purchased with great enthusiasm. When I was resting at work before, I saw online that eating this can enhance the body's immune system, exercise the body, and quickly replenish energy. It's a great thing, so I bought one can of 32, and 2 cans of 56 for one. Of course, I had to buy 2 cans, so I ate 2 cans of gray. Fortunately, it hasn't been long and we can still eat it now. Just now, after exercising, not only did he feel muscle soreness, but he also felt a bit hungry in his stomach. Now he is planning to soak some milk powder and drink it, and then go stretch his muscles. Although stretching feels sore now, he still plans to do it well, otherwise he might feel uncomfortable walking tomorrow. Wash the bowl clean. Li Ming just opened the milk powder can and wanted to brew it. A light footsteps came from the kitchen door, and when he turned around, Zhang Yuan came. Hey, Li Ming, you're making milk powder. Seeing Li Ming brewing milk powder, Zhang Yuan felt a bit embarrassed and walked up to take a closer look. Then, she bravely helped him pour hot water and added some of her own sugar. Drinking milk powder alone doesn't taste, adding some sugar tastes good. Okay, thank you. Li Ming was a bit stunned by Zhang Yuan's movements. The kitchen space was already not large, and Zhang Yuan still had a faint fragrance on her body. If it weren't for the pain he had just practiced, he was afraid of making a fool of himself. Upon hearing her words, he quickly awkwardly spoke up to cover it up. It's okay, drink quickly. Zhang Yuan used chopsticks to stir the milk powder that Li Ming had placed on the kitchen counter, tried the water, and smiled as she handed it to him. Thank you. Li Ming was taken aback, quickly finished the task, and then took a big sip. After drinking a large bowl of sweet and rich milk powder, the hunger in his stomach was instantly cleared. Li Ming felt much better in an instant. He put down the bowl and was about to thank him, but Zhang Yuan picked up the dishes and took them to clean. After finishing washing quickly, he also handed a tissue to Li Ming to wipe his mouth. You just practiced so well, aren't you afraid that you won't be able to get sore tomorrow? Li Ming took the tissue at a loss and wiped her mouth. Zhang Yuan felt extremely embarrassed for a moment, and now it's not good to just say that she wants to borrow some food. So the topic shifted and brought up Li Ming's exercise. It's okay, I'm just planning on stretching later. Li Ming's sudden enthusiastic conversation with Zhang Yuan was a bit muffled, but it also reflected a bit. When he thought about what he said just now and Zhang Yuan's reaction now, he almost had a guess in his heart. Thinking of this answer, he didn't want to say much. After speaking, he went to the living room to start stretching and training based on the exercises he had downloaded from his phone before. When he pulled on the twisted muscles, he let him inhale directly. Fortunately, he gritted his teeth and persisted, stretching hard beyond the time before changing movements. Zhang Yuan followed out of the kitchen and saw Li Ming stretching. Seeing him grinning as he stretched, she suddenly blurted out a sentence. How about I help you press your legs and arms, so you won't have trouble exercising tomorrow? Massage is very effective in relieving muscle strains. Seeing Li Ming, who had just finished stretching but still had some discomfort, looking over in surprise, Zhang Yuan quickly added that her skin was snow-white under the light. Oh, really? Li Ming has not exercised for a long time, and he really has no idea about the effect of stretching after exercise. If a day's training is delayed, it will undoubtedly cause him to lose a lot of time. Hearing her say this, he immediately felt a little tempted. Isn't that good? Li Ming looks at Peng Zhi's room and feels a bit reluctant. It's okay, there's a sofa here anyway. Just lie here and I'll press it for you. Seeing Li Ming agree, Zhang Yuan quickly spoke up and quickly swept the sofa, saying to Li Ming. Li Ming hesitated and looked back at Peng Zhi at home without any movement. It was probably fine, and they were all in this living room, not in his home. It shouldn't be anything, so he lay down a bit stiff. Rub the muscles loose, and they won't hurt anymore when you wake up tomorrow. Zhang Yuan quickly smiled and spoke up, then stood by the sofa and began pinching the muscles on Li Ming's legs and body. Li Ming let out a light sigh. It was a bit sour, and Zhang Yuan's massage was surprisingly effective. I have done traditional Chinese medicine recovery before and learned it. Seeing Li Ming's widened eyes, Zhang Yuan smiled lightly and then pressed harder. Li Ming immediately felt that this was effective in relieving muscle pain, so she gritted her teeth and endured it. After finishing the massage, Li Ming smiled and thanked him, then borrowed some water from the water purifier to drink, and returned home to start sleeping. Zhang Yuan also smiled and said goodbye, then returned home, only to be stunned and the door closed and she looked at her husband standing inside looking out. Has he agreed to borrow grain? Upon seeing his wife return, Peng Zhi quickly asked. I forgot to ask. Zhang Yuan was taken aback. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Initial Entry Path. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 Initial Entry Path. It's okay if it's not easy to speak up for the first time. Let's continue tomorrow. Upon hearing that his wife didn't even ask, Peng Zhi frowned and asked you to borrow food. Did you go chat with him? Not even asking questions. However, he still suppressed his dissatisfaction and shook his head, dispelling his thoughts. Alright, go to sleep. Peng Zhi waved his hand and didn't think about it anymore. He picked up a pear and washed it to eat. Zhang Yuan also relaxed after listening to her husband's words. Seeing him take a pear to eat, she looked at the remaining 2 pears and frowned. Didn't she say to save on eating? There are only 3 pears left. Why did she eat another one now? I'm a bit thirsty, eat pears to quench my thirst. Alright, that's it. I haven't eaten the remaining 2, haven't I? Hurry up and go to bed. A strange roar human screams various sounds intertwined in the darkness, and the night was not as calm as it appeared. After exercising and stretching, Li Ming slept until the next morning. When he woke up, not long after the sun had just risen, he looked at the time and it was only 7 o'clock sharp. I woke up refreshed and stretched my waist, feeling a slight soreness on my body, but it was not as severe as I had imagined. Stretching is indeed useful. A smile appeared on the corner of Li Ming's mouth. If that were the case, his exercise progress would not be delayed at all. That's not right, maybe it's a massage effect. After praising and stretching in his heart, Li Ming suddenly remembered the scene where Peng Zhi's wife worked hard to massage him last night, and felt a bit uncertain. Is it the massage that has a greater effect, or is it the self-stretching that has a greater effect? Forget it, just give it a try tonight and you'll know. It seems a bit bad to always have his wife massage him. Li Ming shook his head to dispel this idea and decided to try the effect of stretching alone tonight. Looking out the window, everything seemed calm and peaceful if it weren't for the zombies wandering on the same floor opposite and the eye-catching red blood stains. Li Ming's eyes were low and he silently withdrew his gaze. From yesterday until today, he had not been calm. The screams and roars seemed to echo in his ears like the sound of death. He forced himself to ignore them before reluctantly falling asleep. If it weren't for exercising and being massaged, Li Ming knew he would never sleep so soundly in the middle of the night, and there was a high probability that he would be awakened by screams. It's just a pity, even though he has compassion upon hearing these screams before death, he is still just an ordinary person, and self-rescue is still difficult. How can he save others? Taking a light breath, Li Ming stopped thinking about these things and urgently put on his shoes to go to the bathroom for a wash. Fortunately, there was still water. Taking water to cook rice, Li Ming cruelly ate 3 eggs in the morning. After finishing eating, he continued practicing with his long sword in the room. The long sword thrust steadily, exerting all the strength of the waist, legs, and arms. Bow step stab sword. Whoosh! Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, a short piece of transparent information drifted by, and Li Ming vaguely felt that he had a better understanding of how to wield the sword. He then withdrew his long sword and stabbed it again. Whoosh! Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, take the sword, stand up, stab. Every time Li Ming stabbed his sword, he exerted all his strength with all his might, and now every sword he used is qualified, so he can gain proficiency with every sword. In this way, obtaining proficiency with each sword and increasing skill proficiency has become an easy task. However, each thrust of the sword with full force actually consumed a lot of energy, and after only 10 attempts, Li Ming was already a bit tired. He gritted his teeth and burst out 20 swords with all his might, finally losing his strength. Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, a short line of information drifted past the upper part of the field of vision, and Li Ming felt that he gradually understood how to stab the long sword. Just a series of high-intensity stabbing swords made his right hand and even his legs feel a bit weak, and he couldn't continue, so he had to withdraw his sword and rest. Bowing and stabbing sword, 55% for beginners and beginners. Looking at the proficiency of lunge and sword thrusting again, I nodded in satisfaction, exhaled slightly, and sat down in a chair to rest. I don't know what changes will occur after upgrading this proficiency level. In his heart, he guessed that Li Ming felt his tired body and thought it was better to stretch, so he took 2 sips of water and got up to stretch again. I continued to sit until 9 o'clock and felt my strength recover a lot. Then, I regained my composure and continued practicing stabbing swords. Whoosh! Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, the information drifted by, and Li Ming practiced more attentively. With the first wave of training in the morning, this time he practiced more smoothly. Unfortunately, his stamina was limited. Even if he gritted his teeth and stabbed his sword, he could only manage to strike 30 swords without any energy left. Looking at the proficiency of lunge and sword thrusting again, it has increased to 85%, and it's only 15 points away from reaching the full level. It's almost there. Li Ming took a deep breath and then sat trembling on the chair to rest, feeling his tired muscles trembling. After taking a few strong sips of water, resting for 10 minutes, gritting his teeth and stretching, he continued to rest for another half hour. At 10.30, Li Ming felt his legs no longer tremble and gritted his teeth and stood up. Draw your sword and stab. Whoosh! The long sword tried its best, but there was no destructive thrust. Fortunately, due to its full force thrust and standard movements, proficiency increased. Li Ming gritted his teeth and thrust out 15 swords in one breath, finally filling his proficiency. Then, amidst his expectant gaze, a new wave of information rushed into his mind out of thin air. Bowing and stabbing sword, 0% initial path. As a beginner at the entrance level, have you really upgraded? It turns out that the strength of the waist is the key when stabbing swords. Li Ming's heart flashed with a sudden realization, and then he couldn't help but hold his sword and follow the emerging realization, fiercely twisting his waist and stabbing the sword. Whoosh! With a fierce sword thrust, there was no movement in front of Li Ming's eyes. He grinned, knowing that his stamina had run out this time and that his stabbing was not qualified. He reluctantly put away his sword. It's almost 11 o'clock. Stretch and stretch, eat first. Taking a breath out of his mouth, Li Ming felt that he couldn't be so anxious, otherwise he would only get twice the result with half the effort. Taking a break to recover his strength would obviously lead to better exercise results. Moreover, looking at the red tassel gun next to him, Li Ming felt that it was better to focus on mastering a weapon to a certain extent before practicing it, rather than distracting his energy. First, practice stabbing swords well, and then practice the long spear when you can easily strike a sword with enough power, or when you upgrade to a stun. After all, swords are relatively shorter than guns, and can handle more scenarios with insufficient space, with a wide range of applications. In secret, Li Ming decided to place his sword at the head of the bed, then stood up and stretched his exercise area, exhaled, and went out to the public kitchen to prepare lunch. As soon as I opened the door, I saw Zhang Yuan walking towards the kitchen wearing a red shirt and white shorts. This woman really loves wearing shorts. Come and make lunch. In front of him, Li Ming quickly withdrew his gaze from his long legs, looked at the woman in front, and greeted him with a smile. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Waiting for Rescue. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Waiting for Rescue. Yeah, you were just about to cook. By the way, how was your rest last night? Upon hearing Li Ming greet her, Zhang Yuan's face showed a smile, revealing her white teeth and responding. Thank you very much for your massage. I slept soundly and didn't feel any soreness when I woke up today. Li Ming dared not look at the skin revealed on her body, but stared into her eyes and responded with a forced standard smile. It's best not to exercise so hard before going to bed at night. By the way, don't turn on the range hood too much power when cooking later. I'm afraid that too much noise will attract some monsters. Zhang Yuan's face looked a bit tired. Last night, the screams of zombies disturbed her and her husband, but they didn't sleep well. Unfortunately, they didn't dare to turn on the lights and were so scared that they didn't know how long they had to endure before falling asleep. So much so that even though she has woken up, her spirit is also a bit sluggish, and now she feels a bit scared and trembling whenever she makes any noise at home. She didn't dare to cook in the morning, and by noon she was so hungry that she couldn't help but go out to cook when she happened to meet Li Ming. Afraid that the power of the range hood may attract any monsters. Li Ming's eyes were strange, but as he looked at the other person's tired and worried expression, he nodded and agreed. Seeing Li Ming agreeing, Zhang Yuan breathed a sigh of relief and then smiled at him before turning to the kitchen to cook. After being frightened last night, her husband Peng Zhi temporarily lost his mind of playing tricks, to the extent that Zhang Yuan forgot about borrowing food. Her habitual thinking in urban life makes her and even her husband feel that food is not something difficult to obtain. They didn't speak up, so Li Ming naturally wouldn't know these thoughts. Now that he was already very hungry, he didn't have the heart to think about it. After Zhang Yuan walked into the kitchen, he also walked closely behind. The shared kitchen is not very large, even if it is a public kitchen. Fortunately, there are 2 gas stoves inside that can allow 2 people to cook at the same time. Choosing and cutting vegetables, the 2 of them inevitably walk back and forth in the narrow space, occasionally rubbing against each other's skin, almost making it difficult for human relationships to control themselves. Li Ming dared not look too much at Zhang Yuan's white legs and skin, nor did he dare to think about the softness he accidentally touched. He hastily cooked himself some food and said hello before leaving the kitchen. The rice is in the room, and he plans to sit inside and eat it. We need to hurry up. After finishing his meal in a big gulp, Li Ming looked at the rice cooker and leftover rice, feeling a bit worried. The urgency to obtain more resources became stronger in his heart. If one day the gas runs out and there is a power outage, how can he survive here even if he has food? The gas should still last for 2 months, so get some alcohol cubes for later use. Thinking in his heart, Li Ming touched his sore arm and sighed slightly. It's too far to think about these things now. Let's wait until he has the confidence to face the zombies directly. Thinking to himself, Li Ming took the dishes to the kitchen to brush them, then washed them up and went back to his room to lie down on the bed and start resting. The room without air conditioning was a bit hot, but fortunately he had adapted. Driven by fatigue, Li Ming quickly fell asleep. The sound of zombies still echoes between heaven and earth, as if they wander tirelessly. After sleeping for half an hour, Li Ming woke up and took a deep breath, feeling much more comfortable on his body. Power restored, start practicing. The energy crisis that came to mind today made Li Ming's sense of urgency even stronger. He was afraid that he would have to face the crisis without gaining enough strength. Hurriedly standing up from the bed, Li Ming drew out his long sword and stood still in the room, recalling a brand new sword-piercing technique in his heart. He began to diligently train his sword-piercing skills in the room over and over again. Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, the summer afternoon sunshine is still so bright, and the room is stuffy and hot. Drops of air conditioning water dripped down from the sky, and the subtle clattering sound attracted a zombie to stand and watch in a daze. However, upstairs, a man and a woman were very nervous in their hearts. Look, I just said it's okay. Seeing that there was no movement in the zombie below, Peng Zhi withdrew the mirror he had looked at below and turned to his wife with a smile. Husband, I still think it might be a bit dangerous. It's so dangerous outside now, it wouldn't be good if we brought zombies because we turned on the air conditioning. Zhang Yuan hid in the room and couldn't help but say as her husband retrieved the mirror and blew the air conditioning. Hey, what are you afraid of? Our floor is so high, what can it hear? Peng Zhi waved his hand indifferently and looked at the last pear on the table. He picked it up and took a bite, saying, besides, if we don't turn on the air conditioning in such hot weather, what if it heats us up? Listen to me, turn it on. I can't wait until night to close it. Peng Zhi took a fierce bite of the pear, feeling the sweetness blooming in his mouth, and his pores were about to open up in satisfaction. Upon hearing Peng Zhi's words, Zhang Yuan frowned, but felt the coolness brought by the air conditioning. She accepted it and then looked at Peng Zhi gnawing on pears, feeling dissatisfied. We only have 3 pears left, didn't we say we'll keep them for later consumption? Anyway, the pear will have to be eaten sooner or later. I'll cut it in half for you. If you don't eat it now, what if it spoils the insects? Peng Zhi waved his hand and used a fruit knife to cut half of Zhang Yuan's previously bitten portion, handing it to her with a smile and saying, when we are rescued, we will have as many pears as we need. The pear had already been eaten, and there was no use saying anything else. Zhang Yuan took the half of the pear and started eating it in anger. Not to mention, eating snow-white pears in the hot summer is really a pleasure. Zhang Yuan ate comfortably and squinted her eyes. After finishing eating, she touched the sweat on her body and got up to tidy up 2 clothes and take a shower in the bathroom. Peng Zhi sat leisurely by the bedside playing single-player games, unaware of the passage of time. In the middle, his wife came out to watch downloaded TV on her phone, and he didn't pay attention. In the blink of an eye, as the afternoon passed, the sky slowly darkened. Wife, it's time to go cook. Peng Zhi suddenly realized that the light had not been turned on, so he quickly turned it on and called Zhang Yuan to cook. Got it. Zhang Yuan put down her phone, stretched lazily, sat up from the bed, tidied up the dishes, and prepared to cook. Bowing and stabbing sword, 67% of the initial entry path, it's not working. Stretch and go cook. Ming let out a fierce breath, feeling that he didn't even have the strength to hold the sword. He immediately gave up the idea of continuing training, sheathed his long sword, and began gritting his teeth to stretch his muscles in the room. After stretching his muscles and feeling more comfortable, Ming opened the door to cook. As soon as the door opened, a fragrant breeze blew in and Zhang Yuan, who looked clean all over her body, walked past. Ming smiled at her, gave a brief greeting, and quickly cooked his own dinner. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Proficient in the Heart. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Proficient in the Heart. Comfortable, in front of the bathroom, Ming felt refreshed after taking a shower. He got up and drank a bowl of milk powder, while also taking the sharpening stone from the kitchen to the bathroom. Take out the long sword and start carefully polishing the blade and tip with a sharpening stone. He is going out with a sword to kill zombies, and weapons without blades are not enough. Let's take advantage of today to sharpen the sword first. Z. The sound of grinding the sword spread through the gatehouse to the outside, and Zhang Yuan, who had just finished washing the dishes, could hear it. When she returned home, she told her husband about it. This guy really wants to use his broken sword to fight zombies. Peng Zhi didn't take it seriously, even thought it was ridiculous, and immediately burst out laughing. I see that he has been exercising very seriously these past few days. He's sweating all over his body while eating, probably exercising in his room. Zhang Yuan frowned and thought for a moment before speaking. How else can we say that there is a difference between people? Some people are destined to succeed, while others cannot. Peng Zhi smiled with disdain on his face and said, "Do you really think he can deal with zombies with just his fake skills? I think he should be scared to see zombies just because of his bear-like appearance. This fool is still practicing swordsmanship. He's useless at practicing guns. If he goes out, he'll have to be torn alive by zombies. In this situation, if there is food available, we need to save it and leave it for rescue. He can't beat zombies with his training. What's the use of it? I think it's just a waste of food. If he doesn't go out and get bitten by zombies, he'll starve to death at home." Peng Zhi sneered repeatedly, and as he spoke, he suddenly heard a scream from the opposite building, followed by the crazy roar of zombies. "Help, help, zombies are eating people, help. Ah! Roar!" In an instant it was as if a pot had exploded, and the entire floor of the community was filled with the roaring of zombies. Peng Zhi's face turned pale in fear. His wife Zhang Yuan also remained stiff in the same place, unable to show any signs of grandeur. The bad news lasted for 10 minutes before gradually calming down, and the community returned to tranquility, as if the screams and zombie roars of the riot just now did not exist. But the two people in the room still couldn't move for a long time. "Honey, why don't we turn off the air conditioning?" Zhang Yuan's body trembled and she spoke with a hint of crying in her voice. "Turn off, yes, turn off the air conditioning, turn it off now, fast, 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 close the door, turn off all the lights." Peng Zhi woke up from a dream and quickly turned off the air conditioning. Then, he locked the door and threw himself onto the bed to turn off the lights. Zhang Yuan had already climbed onto the bed, and the room was completely quiet. Peng Zhi stared blankly at the residential building across from him, knowing without saying anything in his heart what had happened again. The despair in that voice was so touching. "Huh, wife, do you hear me? No one can beat zombies. We don't even have handguns, let alone fight zombies. Honestly, save food and drink, we can only survive when someone comes to save us." Peng Zhi felt a glimmer of happiness in his heart, and turned around to speak softly to his wife. Startled, Zhang Yuan kept nodding, and a hint of satisfaction flashed through Peng Zhi's heart. Then, his eyes fixed tightly on the window with curtains drawn, hoping that the zombie would never come knocking on him. Throwing water onto the blade of the sword, Ming looked at the extremely sharp blade and tip that had been polished by himself, and breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. He sheathed his long sword, walked out of the bathroom, and looked faintly at the residential building across from him through the window with curtains drawn. He also heard the terrifying screams and roars just now, which made his sense of crisis even more intense. Holding the sword hilt, Ming shook his head. He was already tired enough today, and transitional training may affect his training tomorrow. He still gave up the idea of staying up late for exercise. In the apocalypse. With 2 words uttering from his mouth, Ming couldn't help but think of an equally sharp question in his heart. Will there be a rescue? The army's powerful strength should be able to deal with these monsters. Ming recalled the zombies he had encountered in the community before, thinking to himself, but then shook his head and said, "Anyway, we need to save ourselves first, sleep first, and continue training tomorrow when we wake up." The training of stabbing swords is not only about swordsmanship, but also about his strength and spirit. Even if there is a rescue in the end and new weapons are obtained, his constantly recovering strong body can still be used. And now, guns and swords are the only weapons that can be relied on. Thinking in his heart, Ming placed the long sword in the easiest position to reach by the pillow and lay down on the bed, falling into a deep sleep. The first complete day of the apocalypse has passed. But for many people, life is not peaceful, and fear exist in everyone's heart. There are also countless reckless people who have paid the price of their lives. The screams in the community are not just happening here the next day, in the morning. The sunshine is still bright, and the indoors in summer is still so stuffy and hot. But someone is sweating profusely in such an environment. The 33rd Sword. Li Ming took a deep breath, followed closely by twisting his legs, twisting his waist, and fiercely stabbing his sword forward. Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, bowing and stabbing sword, proficient in heart 0%, 2 lines of transparent information drifted past my eyes, followed by an inexplicable realization of the stabbing sword in my heart. When stabbing the sword, the posture of the legs should be coordinated to exert force, and the angle of the right arm holding the sword should be stabbed. All kinds of detailed information are included. Li Ming instantly understood how to stab a sword more conveniently and smoothly. Thinking of achieving it, he immediately attempted to lift his sword and thrust it out. Kicking, turning waist, stabbing sword, smooth. Whoosh. Bow step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, another line of information drifted before his eyes, and his proficiency in stabbing swords increased accordingly. Li Ming also gained some of his mistakes in this level of stabbing sword posture, and a flash of brilliance flashed in his eyes. Fast, according to this progress, with 2 more levels, it should be almost powerful. It has been a day and a half since he woke up from a coma, and even this morning, 2 days have actually passed. During these 2 days, he has continuously stabbed hundreds of swords, and now he finally feels that the power of the stabbing sword is about to achieve his goal. And dealing with zombies. Knowing how to stab the sword is enough. A flash of excitement flashed in his heart, and Li Ming couldn't control himself and stabbed several more swords, but he also felt tired as his proficiency increased. He stopped practicing and stretched his muscles, then stopped and started sitting, drinking water and resting. After resting for half an hour, he stood up and stabbed his sword again. Whoosh! The long sword pierced through the air and was already quite powerful. Li Ming stabbed more than 20 swords in one breath, and more than half of them successfully increased his proficiency. Just that he had already felt tired, he stretched again and continued to rest. Half an hour later, he got up again and continued. He trained like this until noon, sweating profusely, before taking his sword and eating. When I went out to cook, I found that Peng Zhi and his wife had already prepared their meal and were eating with the door open. Looking back, I happened to see Peng Zhi, dressed in sandals, crossing his legs and fanning leisurely, looking at me with his gaze. Li Ming frowned and didn't speak. He walked to the kitchen to prepare the food and brought it to his room to eat. Amidst constant training and rest, time flashed into darkness. After finishing his meal, Li Ming sharpened the tip of the red tassel gun before taking a shower and sleeping. Before going to bed, he glanced at the panel, and after an afternoon of exercise, his proficiency in lunge and sword thrusting had once again improved. Bowing and stabbing sword, proficient in heart 53%, compared to the initial approach of stabbing swords, it is much more difficult to improve proficiency in the realm of mind, but with his continuous practice of stabbing, it still improves rapidly. Moreover, his own strength is slowly increasing. With the exercise of these 2 days, a long sword weighing over 3 pounds in his hands has become very natural, and the number of full thrusts during sword practice is also gradually increasing. This proves that his strength is steadily increasing with his skills. I hope nothing happens in the next 2 days. Li Ming secretly thought to himself that he only wanted to accumulate strength quickly and didn't want to make any unexpected mistakes. He slowly fell asleep while pondering. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Lack of grain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Lack of grain. Since starting to exercise diligently every day, Li Ming has become incredibly sweet every time he sleeps. As soon as he slept until dawn, he immediately got up to wash up and eat. After finishing the meal, digest a little and immediately exercise with a sword. He is still the simplest stab sword, constantly practicing in the room, and his mastery level also increases with his practice. With each sword, the standing position of the legs, the angle of the long sword's thrust, the curvature and angle of the arms are constantly changing. Strive for perfection. So, in the blink of an eye, the whole morning passed. After another rest, Li Ming's body stopped exercising. Bao step sting sword, proficient and proficient at 0%, a message drifted through the air before Li Ming's eyes, and he instantly felt that he had gained many insights of stabbing swords in his heart. My realization this time is, how to stab the sword when not in a lunge. Chewing on the information, Li Ming silently withdrew his lunge and tried to twist and stab his sword in a normal standing posture. The sword moved with the thrust of his right arm, but it did not trigger a proficiency response. This is not right, maybe we should open up a little distance first. Li Ming sighed and shook his head. The sword he had just struck had no power to speak of. After careful consideration, his legs parted slightly and he tried to stab the sword again. Whoosh! The long sword pierced through the air with good momentum, but it still did not trigger a proficiency reaction. Forget it, take a break after dinner before practicing. Li Ming exhaled a long breath, knowing that it was difficult to train anything with his tired body, so he decided to put his sword in its sheath and start cooking in the kitchen. Humble, when the stove was turned on, it was still a combination of meat and vegetables. The meat Li Ming purchased was enough for him to eat for a week. Now is the time to exercise and improve his strength, so he naturally won't be polite. After finishing the stir-fry, he returned to his room as usual and started eating. After finishing dinner, I started to rest and slept until the afternoon. Then, I got up again and began to ponder the cultivation essence of the thorn sword, which is proficient in understanding levels. He first spread his legs wide enough for him to exert all his strength, and then slowly contracted the distance bit by bit, continuously training. Finally, I saw the results at 5 p.m. Li Ming stood with his legs almost side by side, only a fist away, slightly bent, and then twisted his waist to stab his sword. Whoosh! The long sword pierced out, and Li Ming's clothes made a shout. Bao step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, a wave of information drifted by, and Li Ming's proficiency in stabbing swords finally rose again. His eyes shone brightly, and he immediately worked hard and continued to practice. 1 sword, 2 swords. There was still no news, so Li Ming frowned and continued to stab. So, after 10 swords in a row, information finally drifted by once again. Bao step and sword stabbing proficiency +1, Li Ming breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that there was still room for improvement, but the series of stabbing swords had left him feeling a bit tired. Instead of continuing to exercise, he sat back in his chair and took a few sips of salt water to rest quietly. Half an hour later, he stood up again to train, and this time he stabbed nearly 40 swords in a row, increasing his proficiency by 4. Satisfied, Li Ming nodded and continued to rest for half an hour before getting up to continue training. So, it was not until 9:30 p.m. that Li Ming slowly stopped exercising. Bao step sting sword, 32% proficient and proficient, eat. After biting his teeth in place and stretching for a while, Li Ming, who already knew that stretching was the key to avoiding muscle soreness, naturally wouldn't forget it. After stretching everything, he exhaled and went to the kitchen to cook dinner. Glancing at Peng Zhi in his wife's room, they had already rested early, and Li Ming didn't mind either. He cooked his own meals, cleaned up the dishes, took a shower, and brewed a bowl of milk powder. Before going to bed, feel full all over. Li Ming suddenly felt a little restless, his mind couldn't help but think about Zhang Yuan's buttocks, Zhang Yuan's legs. I'm tired. Let's take a break. Li Ming quickly took a breath, knowing that it had been several days without venting his anger and his desire had risen. He quickly dispelled his thoughts and began to fall asleep. The 4th day of the end is over. Every day in summer is so bright and sunny. Peng Zhi sat by the bedside, finally clearing the single-player game. He couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief and instinctively threw away his phone, wanting to uninstall it. Suddenly, he remembered that there was no internet now, and uninstalling it would make him unable to play anymore. Immediately, he quickly let go of his fingers, sighed, cleared his data, and planned to continue playing. And his wife Zhang Yuan was bored and lost in thought, until she felt hungry before leaving the room to cook. When passing by Li Ming's house, he seemed to have finished his lunch break and was practicing stabbing swords with the door open, sweating profusely. The majesty of the stabbing swords surprised her quite a bit. Zhang Yuan suddenly realized that it was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon before she knew it, and she was only preparing to have her first meal. The past few days have been reversed. Shaking her head, Zhang Yuan looked at Li Ming, who was full of energy and some envied him for having something to do. Unlike her who was bored all day, she immediately shook her head and dug half a bowl of rice to cook. While cooking, Zhang Yuan frowned as she looked at the only 4 potatoes left. She went back and wanted to add more rice, only to find that there was only a little left. The rice is still enough to eat until the day after tomorrow, but the vegetables. Zhang Yuan pursed her lips and picked up 2 potatoes to wash. When she was preparing to eat, she mentioned the matter to her husband. 2 shredded potatoes can also be stir-fried on a plate. After finishing the meal, Zhang Yuan carried the dishes and rice back. When passing by Li Ming's doorstep, she saw him still silently stabbing his sword, sweating profusely. She immediately admired him and quickly quickened her steps back to her own home. We only have 2 potatoes left, and 3 small bowls of rice. Peng Zhi sat down on the table, smelling the aroma of the rice. Zhang Yuan handed him chopsticks and reminded him. I finished eating so quickly. Peng Zhi was taken aback for a moment, and immediately became somewhat dissatisfied. He was about to ask why he didn't save time eating, but then realized that he was clamoring to make more every day. He immediately shut up and thought for a moment, when you finish eating, go borrow some from Li Ming. That kid should be easy to talk to. Zhang Yuan pursed her lips and silently left half of the shredded potatoes for dinner. Fortunately, the 2 of them stay at home every day without much consumption, and even after deliberately saving a plate of shredded potatoes, they only ate half of it. In the blink of an eye, at night, Zhang Yuan made do with the hot food and ate another meal. Before going to bed, she was nervously thinking that the remaining potatoes could only be eaten for a day at most. How should she borrow something from Li Ming then? She wondered when she would slowly fall asleep. Li Ming took a breath and walked out of the bathroom, comfortably lying on the bed. He immediately opened the panel, feeling satisfied in his heart. Bowing and stabbing sword, 74% proficient and proficient. After a day of hard training, he has honed his proficient level of archery and stabbing sword to 74%. If this speed is maintained, he will be able to upgrade his skills again by the end of tomorrow morning. The stab sword at this level is already very convenient, and Li Ming, the stab sword at the next level, feels that he will not be disappointed. With anticipation in his heart, Li Ming slowly fell asleep. The 5th day of the apocalypse ended in a deep sleep. In the blink of an eye, the sun rises and the 6th day arrives. Li Ming still woke up early when the sun was rising. He cooked 3 eggs for himself, chewed them one by one and ate them slowly. Then he drank a bowl of milk powder and finally a bowl of congee and fried vegetables. After washing the dishes, he immediately threw himself back into the training of lunge and swordsmanship, constantly striving to improve his proficiency in lunge and swordsmanship through sweat. Bow step sting sword, 78% proficient and proficient. Bow step sting sword, 84% proficient and proficient. Bow step sting sword, proficient and 95% proficient. In the blink of an eye, the morning ended with only the last 5% of proficiency left. Li Ming, who was somewhat exhausted, did not rush to work hard, but instead stretched his muscles to cook and prepare for training after lunch break. When Li Ming walked out into the living room, he saw the door of Peng Zhi's house suddenly closed. He didn't know what was going on, but he didn't mind and went into the kitchen to start making his own things. Hurry up, he happened to be cooking. Go borrow it quickly. Peng Ji, who saw Li Ming going to the kitchen through the crack in the door, closed the door and turned back to urge his wife who was washing up in the bathroom. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Panel Growth. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10 Panel Growth. Unlike Li Ming, Peng Ji and Zhang Yuan stay at home every day without any exercise, hungry to eat, full to sleep, and their living hours have already changed. They only wake up after 11 o'clock at noon. Although Zhang Yuanqin was so scared that she couldn't sleep at night, she still got up half an hour earlier than Peng Ji and went to the bathroom to wash up. When Peng Ji got up, he happened to see Li Ming going out, so he quickly called his wife in the bathroom. Got it. Zhang Yuan had just finished washing her face and wiped the water droplets with a wet towel. She looked at her husband in anger and couldn't resist hunger. Under Peng Ji's urging, she walked out of the room and waited eagerly in the room. But after thinking for a moment, he felt that Li Ming would definitely borrow it, so he immediately let go and waited leisurely for the result. Humble, the flames were rising in the kitchen, and Li Ming was stir-frying when he suddenly smelled a fragrant breeze. Looking back, Zhang Yuan, who seemed to have just been washed, walked in. Li Ming smiled at her and didn't say much. He continued to stir-fry, with a sword about to break through in his heart. Zhang Yuan, who originally wanted to borrow grain, saw Li Ming busy stir-frying vegetables. Suddenly, she felt that it was not good to speak when others were busy. She hesitated for a while and decided to wait until Li Ming finished stir-frying vegetables. After cooking, Li Ming found that the woman was still watching him at the door. He was surprised and shoveled the vegetables out. He turned around and asked, "What's up?" "I'm a bit embarrassed to say this to you, but I really have no choice. Zombies are everywhere outside, and our house is out of food again. So I want to ask if it's possible to borrow some vegetables." Upon hearing Li Ming's proactive inquiry, Zhang Yuan finally regained her composure. However, at this point, she no longer felt reserved and spoke confidently to Li Ming, with a hopeful expression in her eyes. Borrowing vegetables. Li Ming frowned and glanced at Zhang Yuan, who was wearing super shorts. His heart skipped a beat and he suppressed his anger. After thinking for a moment, he spoke up and responded, "I don't have much food at home either." "Alright, I'll go get you something to eat first." "Really, thank you so much. When we have something in the future, we will definitely return it to you." Upon hearing what Li Ming said, Zhang Yuan breathed a deep sigh of relief and followed closely, patting her chest with a cheerful assurance on her face. "Then I can wait." Li Ming shook his head. In this situation, he couldn't refuse. Fortunately, he had already prepared a plan and picked up the dishes from the kitchen to walk towards his home. Zhang Yuan quickly followed suit. Li Ming didn't care either. When he got home, he put the food on the table and found 5 bags of instant noodles on the ground. He turned around and handed them to Zhang Yuan, who followed him to the room, saying, "I'm really sorry, I can only take out these things." "Ah, it's okay, it's okay. It's good to have instant noodles." Thank you, thank you." Zhang Yuan thought that Li Ming would bring her something, but when she saw him, she handed over 5 packets of instant noodles and was taken aback. She then realized that it was not easy to eat instant noodles at this time, so she quickly took the noodles and thanked Li Ming repeatedly. Li Ming smiled and nodded, watching as she bid farewell and left, and the smile on his lips also narrowed. "Are you joking? He only has enough food to eat for 2 or 3 more days by himself. How could he possibly lend it to them empty-handed? As for instant noodles, Li Mingzong still has 1 box, so it's okay to give 5 packages that are almost expired. We need to accelerate the breakthrough." Thinking of these, Li Ming also felt a sense of urgency in his heart. He couldn't just eat rice to make a living, so he must go to the supermarket. And supermarkets are just the first target, where there are already few fresh and cold vegetables. It is still necessary to choose a place with abundant resources. Li Ming paused in his heart and picked up the food to eat. Now, it's not time to think about transferring. First, enhance your strength. After finishing the meal, Li Ming washed the dishes and returned to his room to slowly fall asleep. In Peng Ji's room, his teeth were itching with anger. This damn thing has no tolerance at all. Does it have any kindness? If you go borrow something, it will end up lending it to us. Peng Ji looked at the 5 packets of instant noodles brought back by his wife and couldn't help but say angrily. How about I give it back to him? Zhang Yuan looked at Peng Ji's appearance, pursed her lips, and asked. What else should I borrow based on my abilities? Let's keep it. Each person should eat a bag first, and 2 potatoes should be left to eat after 2 meals. Peng Ji glared at her, snorted softly, and then left to boil water alone and soak instant noodles in a bowl. Zhang Yuan pursed her lips and followed behind to eat bubble noodles. Half an hour of nap was said to have passed. Li Ming woke up and washed his face with cold water to keep himself awake. Then he felt in excellent condition and took a light breath, lifted his long sword, and practiced stabbing. Whoosh! With legs slightly apart and a sword piercing, the power was extraordinary, and the proficiency information appearing on the panel confirmed this. Bao Step Sting Sword, 96% proficient and proficient. A flash of light flashed in his eyes, and Li Ming thrust his sword one after another with all his might. Finally, with the final thrust, he suddenly felt the muscles and bones on his waist, legs, and right arm writhing violently. In an instant, Li Ming's just-eaten stomach became empty, and a strong sense of hunger emerged from his heart. The information in front of him also changed once again. Stabbing sword, slightly reduced to 0%, in the process of transformation. The lunge stab sword has transformed into a stab sword, and is undergoing transformation. Li Ming felt his strength constantly increasing, especially the muscles involved in the stabbing sword. He quickly went to brew a full half can of milk powder and the hunger in his stomach stopped. Li Ming felt the strength of his body again, his eyes slightly bright. Surprisingly, the panel still has such a function. Li Ming felt the surging power of his body, feeling extremely happy in his heart. He couldn't help but pull out his sword and fiercely thrust it into the void. Whoosh! The sound of the sword piercing through the air sounded, and Li Ming could be certain that it was the sound of the long sword, not his body. And the speed is much faster than before. And the whole body's strength condenses into one place, the strength is very strong. The strength has actually increased so much, I just don't know how much it has actually increased. After breaking through to this level, not only did his strength become stronger, but his skills also naturally increased rapidly. He just casually shook his sword just now, and the long sword stabbed out with full power. Li Ming felt the real change and was overjoyed in his heart. With this effect, I feel at ease. If I can constantly upgrade, wouldn't my physical fitness also continue to break through its limits with this power? Li Ming's mind was constantly flickering with thoughts, and he couldn't help but experiment with a brand new stabbing sword in place. He found that he could naturally and freely thrust a sword, but the power did not diminish at all. Whoosh! Li Ming stood in place casually, stabbed to the right, and his long sword slashed through the air with equal power. Especially Li Ming drew his sword and looked at the night mosquito that had been stabbed by him on the tip of his sword. A glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. Just now, he saw that the mosquito was deliberately trying to test whether he could hit it, and as a result, it hit. Quick, accurate, powerful enough to stab the sword. Li Ming concluded in his heart that the sense of crisis that had been going on for several days had finally slightly weakened, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of certainty. Especially when the proficiency panel can directly improve physical fitness, it makes him extremely happy. He couldn't wait to start training the stabbing sword in place again. The new level of stabbing sword became more and more proficient in his hands, but what made him frown was that he stabbed dozens of swords in a row, but the progress on the proficiency panel remained motionless. I don't know how to improve the stabbing sword at this level anymore, and now the stabbing sword has almost exerted all my strength. Is it because of this? Ming couldn't help but speculate in his heart, but he felt a little relieved. Then he grabbed his sword flower and looked at the corner of his mouth, revealing a smile. He found the maintenance oil he gave when buying the sword, and when he opened and wiped the long sword for the first time, his eyes flashed with light. If you train your spear well again, you can go out and find something. Thinking to himself, Ming felt his now strong body and became more confident. An excited emotion surged in his heart. He sheathed the lightest long sword, carried it with him behind his back, and then looked at the spear to the side. He took a deep breath, took the spear with one hand, and walked to the living room. Long spear, stop nausea. Ming's eyes flashed with vitality, his left hand in front and his right hand behind, and he began practicing repeatedly in the living room. Spear Proficiency +1, end of this chapter.